5 days. That was all the time Ranger had left. 5 days before the paperwork inside a gray metal cabinet would become irreversible. 5 days before the most feared dog in the Pacific Coast Canine Rescue Center would disappear forever. Nobody questioned the decision anymore. For nearly 2 years, every expert who had entered the isolation wing had reached the same conclusion. Ranger was beyond saving. 3 handlers had been seriously injured. One required reconstructive surgery after a violent bite tore through his forearm. Several experienced trainers had refused to enter his enclosure ever again. Volunteers whispered his name as they hurried past the reinforced steel door at the end of the hallway. Some called him a monster. Others called him cursed. Only a handful remembered that before becoming the shelter's greatest nightmare, he had once been someone's greatest partner. Outside, the California afternoon sun reflected across the windshield of an old pickup truck that rolled slowly into the nearly empty parking lot. It wasn't accompanied by black SUVs. No security team stepped out first. No assistants hurried ahead with clipboards. No photographers waited nearby. Only one man climbed out. Clint Eastwood adjusted the worn leather jacket resting across his shoulders and remained standing beside the truck for a long moment. His eyes never left the rescue center. The building looked ordinary. White walls, blue trim, a simple wooden sign above the entrance. Pacific Coast Canine Rescue Center. Most people would have walked inside without giving the place a second thought. Clint couldn't. His fingers unconsciously slipped into his jacket pocket. They found the old leather collar immediately. The leather had softened after years of use. The brass nameplate was scratched. The edges were cracked. He rubbed it gently with his thumb. Duke. The name escaped his lips so quietly that even he barely heard it. Almost 1 year had passed since he had buried his German shepherd beneath an old oak tree overlooking his property. The house had never sounded the same afterward. Silence had become another piece of furniture. Every room reminded him of a dog that no longer waited by the door. No familiar footsteps followed him into the kitchen. No heavy body settled beside his chair during long evenings. The loneliness wasn't loud. It was quieter than that. It arrived every morning when no tail greeted him. It waited every night beside an empty fireplace. People believed grief faded with time. Sometimes it simply learned to whisper. For months, Clint had driven halfway to different shelters before turning around. Each time he convinced himself he wasn't ready. Each time he returned to an empty home. Until today. He closed the truck door. Without another glance behind him, he walked inside. A bell above the entrance chimed softly. The reception area smelled of disinfectant, damp fur, and fresh coffee. Behind the front desk sat a woman with short, dark hair tied neatly behind her head. Her name tag read, Sam Porter. She looked up automatically, then looked again. Recognition flashed across her tired face. Not excitement, surprise. Mr. Eastwood? Clint smiled politely. Just Clint. She nodded. I've been expecting you. She stepped around the desk. I appreciate you coming. So do I. As they began walking through the main adoption wing, barking erupted from every direction. Happy barking, excited barking, hopeful barking. Dozens of dogs pressed eagerly against their kennel doors. Golden retrievers, Labradors, mixed breeds, young puppies bouncing clumsily over one another. Older dogs wagging slower tails, hoping today might finally be the day someone chose them. Sam smiled as she pointed toward several kennels. "This one's wonderful with children. This little guy loves hiking. That one was abandoned near the freeway, but he's making incredible progress." Clint stopped often. He crouched beside several kennels. He offered his hand patiently. Every dog greeted him differently. Some licked his fingers immediately. Others leaned quietly against the wire. One elderly border collie simply rested his head against Clint's palm. "They're all good dogs," Sam nodded. "They really are." But not everyone gets lucky. They continued deeper into the building. Gradually, the cheerful barking faded. The lighting became colder. Concrete replaced polished flooring. The pleasant atmosphere disappeared. Clint noticed the change immediately. "So this is where people stop adopting?" Sam didn't answer. Instead, she kept walking. At the end of the hallway stood a thick steel security door. 3 bright warning signs covered its surface. "Auth personnel only. Isolation wing. Dangerous animals." Before Clint could ask another question, it happened. A sound echoed from somewhere beyond the steel door. Not barking, not exactly. It was lower, rougher, a sound filled with rage, and something heartbreakingly close to despair. The steel door vibrated. Clint slowly turned toward it. "What was that?" Sam hesitated, long enough to reveal she didn't want to answer. "That's Ranger." Another violent impact slammed against metal from the opposite side. The hinges rattled. Several employees instinctively looked toward the door. One young volunteer quietly stepped backward. "He does that every afternoon." Sam folded her arms. "Usually around this time." Clint looked back at her. "What happened to him?" Before she could answer, 2 kennel workers rounded the corner carrying supplies. Neither noticed Clint immediately. "Only 5 more days," one sighed heavily. "I hate saying it, but maybe it's finally over." The other nodded. "He should have been euthanized months ago." They finally recognized Clint. Their conversation stopped instantly. Both looked embarrassed. They hurried away without another word. 5 days. The number stayed inside Clint's mind. He turned slowly toward Sam. "What happens in 5 days?" She closed her eyes briefly, then answered, "Ranger is scheduled to be euthanized." Silence. Only the distant sound of heavy breathing behind reinforced steel remained. Sam continued quietly. "He arrived almost 2 years ago. We tried everything. Professional trainers, behavior specialists, medication, rehabilitation. Nothing worked." Clint didn't speak. She sighed. "You deserve to know who he was." She leaned against the hallway wall. "Before all this, he wasn't dangerous. He was one of the finest police dogs in Oregon." Clint looked toward the steel door again. Sam continued. "German Shepherd, 7 years old, explosives detection, search and tracking, multiple commendations. He never failed an assignment." "What changed?" Sam swallowed slowly. "His handler." The hallway suddenly felt colder. "Officer Daniel Reyes. They worked together for 5 years. They weren't just partners. They were family." She smiled sadly. "Daniel took Ranger everywhere. Morning runs, family barbecues, camping trips. His kids grew up with that dog." Clint listened without interrupting. Then, one morning, they were sent to an abandoned warehouse in East Portland. Drug raid. Intelligence called it low risk. She looked down. It wasn't. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. Someone was waiting. The suspects opened fire. Sam's voice became quieter. One of the gunmen aimed directly at Ranger. Daniel saw it. He never hesitated. He stepped between the bullets. And his dog, Clint, slowly lowered his eyes. He died there? Sam nodded. In Ranger's arms. They say, she paused, he refused to leave Daniel's body. For 4 hours. The officers couldn't move him. He kept crying, howling, trying to wake him. Her eyes filled with tears. When they finally separated them, the dog that walked away wasn't the same dog. Another violent crash shook the steel door. This time, it sounded less like anger and more like grief. Clint stared at the reinforced entrance. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked the question Sam had hoped he wouldn't. I'd like to meet him. Sam's expression changed instantly. No. I'm serious. So am I. She stepped between Clint and the steel door. You don't understand. No one goes in there. He attacks everyone. Without warning. He doesn't care who you are. Clint nodded calmly. I still want to see him. Behind the steel door. The growling stopped, as though something, or someone, had suddenly started listening. The growling stopped. Not faded. Stopped. The sudden silence felt far more unsettling than the violence that had filled the hallway only seconds earlier. Every employee standing nearby noticed it. One volunteer slowly lowered the catch pole she had instinctively reached for. Another looked through the narrow, reinforced window built into the steel door. He never stops like that, she whispered. Sam frowned. Stay back. She stepped closer to the door herself. On the other side, Ranger stood perfectly still. His massive body remained tense, every muscle ready to explode into motion. But he wasn't looking at the door. He was sniffing the air, slowly, carefully, almost confused. Clint watched quietly. What is he doing? Sam didn't answer immediately. Finally, she admitted, I don't know. She had worked at the rescue center for 6 years. She had watched Ranger attack reinforced barriers until blood stained his paws. She had watched behavior specialists leave defeated. She had watched experienced police canine trainers walk away, shaking their heads. She had never, ever seen him simply stand still. Another employee hurried down the hallway carrying paperwork. What happened? Sam never took her eyes off the window. He stopped. The young man blinked. What do you mean, stopped? He stopped. The employee looked through the window. His face immediately changed. That's impossible. Inside the kennel, Ranger slowly walked toward the front of the enclosure. No barking, no lunging, no snapping, only slow, measured, almost cautious footsteps. His ears lifted slightly. His nose continued searching the air. Clint quietly slipped one hand into the pocket of his leather jacket, his fingers wrapped around Duke's old collar. The worn leather felt exactly the same as it had every day for nearly a year. He hadn't planned to bring it. He simply couldn't leave home without it. Perhaps grief had become a habit, or perhaps some part of him had always hoped another dog might one day understand. He slowly removed the collar. The old brass nameplate caught the fluorescent light. Duke. The moment the leather appeared, everything changed. Ranger froze. Every employee felt it. The atmosphere inside the isolation wing shifted so suddenly that no one dared breathe. The German Shepherd's nostrils widened, once, twice, then again. His eyes locked onto the old collar. Not Clint, the collar. His breathing became slower. The rage that had burned inside him only moments earlier seemed to hesitate, as if another memory, far older, had pushed its way through the anger. Sam stared in disbelief. No, it can't be. Ranger took one careful step closer, then another. Each movement looked uncertain, almost fragile. The powerful police dog who had terrified everyone for 2 years now looked like an animal trying desperately to remember something he thought had been lost forever. Clint slowly knelt in front of the kennel. He never looked Ranger directly in the eyes. He didn't reach toward him. He didn't speak loudly. He simply rested one hand on his knee. The collar lay quietly across his open palm. I had a partner, too. His voice barely rose above a whisper. He wasn't a police dog. But he saved me more times than I'll ever admit. Ranger's ears twitched. Another step. Only the steel bars separated them now. No one in the hallway moved. Sam silently lifted one hand, signaling every employee to remain exactly where they were. One tranquilizer officer whispered, "If he charges." She never finished the sentence, because Ranger didn't charge. Instead, he lowered his head. Very slowly, he pushed his nose between the steel bars. The hallway seemed to stop existing. Clint extended his hand only an inch. Nothing more. Ranger inhaled deeply. Again and again. The scent of old leather, rain, wood smoke, a home, another German shepherd, years of loyalty, years of love. Animals remembered things differently than people, not through photographs, not through words, through scent. To Ranger, the collar carried an entire life. A life where someone had once been loved. A life where someone had once belonged. The massive dog closed his eyes. Then, without warning, a soft sound escaped him. Not a growl, not a bark, a whimper. So quiet. Several people wondered if they had imagined it. Sam covered her mouth. "I've never—" She stopped herself, her eyes filled with tears. "I've never heard him cry." Clint felt his own throat tighten. "Hey, boy. It's all right. You don't have to fight anymore." Ranger leaned farther forward. His nose rested gently against Clint's open hand, not aggressively, not cautiously, simply resting. The old collar remained between them. Neither moved. Nearly 30 seconds passed. No one dared interrupt. One employee quietly wiped tears from his eyes. Another slowly lowered the tranquilizer rifle toward the floor. The silence felt sacred. Finally, Clint looked up. "I'd like to go inside." Every head turned toward him. Sam's expression immediately hardened. "No. You've seen enough." "I haven't." "Clint, if that door opens, everything could change in 1 second." He nodded. "I know. And I still want to meet him." Behind the bars, Ranger never took his eyes off Clint. The dog who had once tried to tear through reinforced steel now stood motionless, waiting, as if, for the first time in 2 years, someone had finally arrived who understood what it meant to lose your best friend. The hallway remained frozen. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even the fluorescent lights seemed louder than before. Ranger still stood against the bars, his muzzle resting quietly against Clint's open hand. The dog everyone feared, the dog scheduled to die in 5 days, had become completely still. Director Frank Holloway arrived only moments later. Tall, gray suit, silver hair, the face of a man who had spent more than 20 years making impossible decisions. He stopped the instant he saw Ranger. Then he looked at Clint. "So, you're the reason everyone stopped working." Sam quickly stepped forward. "Sir, you need to see this." "I already am." Holloway folded his arms. His expression never changed. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Eastwood, but Ranger is not available for adoption." "I'm not here to adopt him." "Then why are you here?" Clint looked toward the German Shepherd. "I'm here because he's still waiting for someone." Holloway shook his head. "No? He's waiting for nothing. That dog died the same day Officer Daniel Reyes died." Clint didn't argue. Instead, he quietly asked, "Have you ever gone inside?" The question caught Holloway off guard. He hesitated. "No." "Why not?" "The reports speak for themselves." "No," Clint replied calmly. "They speak about injuries. They don't speak about him." The hallway fell silent again. Holloway stared at Clint for several long seconds. Then he answered honestly, "I have a responsibility. I can't risk another employee getting hurt. I understand. But I still want to go inside." The answer came instantly. "No." Clint simply nodded. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked away from the kennel, not toward the exit, toward the concrete wall directly opposite Ranger's enclosure. He slowly lowered himself to the floor, crossed one leg, rested his back against the wall, and waited. Holloway frowned. "What exactly are you doing?" "Waiting." "For what?" "For you to change your mind. You can't simply sit here." "I already am." "You'll have to leave." "I'm not disturbing anyone. I'm not touching the kennel. I'm not asking anyone else to take a risk. I'm just sitting." One of the security officers quietly leaned toward Holloway. "Sir, if we physically remove him, the media will have questions." Holloway looked irritated. "I don't care about reporters." Clint smiled faintly. "Neither do I. I care about him." He nodded toward Ranger. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Employees slowly drifted back toward their duties. Yet, every few minutes, someone returned. Just to look. Just to make sure what they thought they had seen had actually happened. Ranger never left the front of the kennel. He lay down on the concrete floor. His head rested between his paws. His eyes remained fixed on Clint. The old rage had disappeared. 40 minutes later, Sam quietly entered Holloway's office. He stood beside the window overlooking the isolation hallway. Without saying anything, she pointed. Holloway looked down. Ranger hadn't moved, not once. "He hasn't barked," Sam whispered. "Not once." Since Clint sat down, Holloway remained silent. "I've worked here 6 years. I've never seen him lie down while another person was nearby." Still, no answer. Finally, very quietly, Holloway spoke. "Prepare the emergency team." Sam turned. "Sir?" "Tranquilizers." "Medical staff." "Animal control." "I want everyone ready." Her heart sank. "You still think he'll attack?" "I hope I'm wrong." He looked toward Clint. "But if I'm right, we only get one chance." 10 minutes later, the hallway filled with personnel, veterinarians, security officers, 2 animal behavior specialists, 3 tranquilizer rifles. Everyone took position. Nobody wanted to blink. Holloway approached Clint. "If I allow this, You follow every instruction. I will. The moment I tell you to leave, you leave. I understand. Holloway slowly nodded toward Sam. Open the kennel. The entire hallway seemed to stop breathing. Sam's hands trembled as she inserted the security key. The electronic lock clicked. One heavy bolt, then another. Finally, the reinforced steel door slowly swung inward. The familiar growl returned, deep, low, ancient. Ranger stood immediately. His body transformed, muscles tightened, tail straight. Every instinct told him someone had entered his territory. Several tranquilizer rifles lifted at exactly the same moment. Clint quietly raised one hand. No. Without another word, he stepped inside. The steel door remained open behind him. Everyone held their breath. Ranger stood nearly 8 feet away. Neither moved. Neither blinked. The silence stretched so long that several employees realized they had forgotten to breathe. Then Clint did something nobody expected. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee, not as a challenge, not as surrender, simply making himself smaller, less threatening. He rested both hands on his knees. The old leather collar lay across his palm. His voice barely carried across the kennel. Hey, Ranger. I know exactly what losing your partner feels like. Ranger's ears twitched. You spent years protecting him. You'd have given your life for him. You still would. Another step, very small, very careful. You weren't dangerous. You were heartbroken. Nobody in the hallway dared move. Even Holloway had lowered his arms. Clint looked directly into Ranger's eyes. I wasn't ready either. My house stayed empty. I kept talking to someone who wasn't there anymore. His voice cracked, very slightly. I carried Duke's collar every single day, because I was afraid that if I stopped, I'd lose him again. Ranger's breathing slowed, the growling faded. One careful step, then another. Only 4 feet remained between them. The dog lowered his head. His nose touched the old leather collar. He inhaled deeply. The scent lingered. Love, loyalty, loss. Home. Then, something inside Ranger finally broke, not violently, quietly. The enormous German shepherd pressed his forehead against Clint's chest. His body began trembling, small at first, then harder. Soft cries escaped him, not growls, not barks, the sound of grief. Finally finding somewhere safe to exist. Tears filled Sam's eyes. One veterinarian quietly removed his glasses. Even Holloway looked away. Clint wrapped one arm gently around Ranger's neck. You don't have to carry it alone anymore. For nearly a full minute, neither of them moved. Man and dog. Both mourning someone they had loved. Both finally understanding that grief recognized grief. Then, without warning, the entire building shook. A deep vibration rolled beneath the concrete floor. The fluorescent lights flickered violently. A loud cracking sound echoed somewhere above them. Everyone froze. Another tremor, stronger this time. A metal pipe burst overhead. Dust rained from the ceiling. Someone screamed. "Earthquake!" The lights exploded into darkness. Emergency alarms began howling through the rescue center. Concrete cracked above the isolation wing. Steel beams groaned. Employees ran toward the exits. Holloway shouted orders no one could hear over the deafening roar. Inside the kennel, Clint instinctively shielded Ranger as the ceiling began to collapse, and before anyone could reach them, the emergency lockdown system activated. With a thunderous metallic crash, the reinforced steel door slammed shut, locking Clint and Ranger inside together. The steel door slammed shut with the force of a bank vault. Boom! Every emergency lock inside the isolation wing engaged at once. Outside, Sam lunged toward the control panel. No! She slammed her hand against the emergency override. Nothing happened. The screen flashed red. System failure. Another violent tremor ripped through the building. Concrete dust poured from the ceiling like gray rain. Employees stumbled toward the exits as alarms screamed through every hallway. Inside the kennel, Clint instinctively wrapped both arms around Ranger. A section of concrete crashed barely 3 feet away. The impact shook the floor beneath them. Dust swallowed the room. Ranger immediately shifted. He wasn't the terrified animal everyone expected. Years of police training awakened inside him. His ears stood erect. His breathing became steady. His eyes scanned every corner of the collapsing room. He wasn't panicking. He was working. Outside the kennel, Sam pounded against the steel door. "Clint!" No answer. Only another explosion somewhere deeper inside the shelter. Director Holloway grabbed a radio. "Fire department, this is Pacific Coast Rescue. We have people trapped inside isolation wing. The emergency locks won't release." Another voice crackled through static. "The earthquake damaged the electrical system. Hold your position. We're coming." Hold your position. Those words felt meaningless. Inside, the ceiling continued cracking. Clint slowly tried to stand. The instant he placed weight on his left leg, a sharp piece of fallen concrete shifted beneath him. It sliced across his calf. He collapsed immediately. Pain exploded through his leg. He looked down. Blood quickly soaked through his jeans. "Damn!" Ranger was beside him before he finished the word. The German shepherd nudged Clint's shoulder, whining softly. "I'm all right," Clint whispered, although he wasn't. Another heavy section of ceiling slammed onto the floor, closer this time. The fire alarm suddenly stopped. Silence. Then, a new sound. Crackling. Electrical wires sparked overhead. Orange flames slowly crawled along broken insulation. Smoke began filling the isolation wing. Clint looked toward the emergency exit nearly 60 feet away. Too far, especially with his injured leg. He attempted to crawl. Pain shot through his entire body. He barely moved 6 inches. He stopped. Ranger watched carefully, his head tilted. Then, something extraordinary happened. The old police dog looked toward the exit, then back toward Clint. Then, he gently grabbed the sleeve of Clint's leather jacket, not aggressively, carefully. He pulled once. Testing. Clint stared. "You want me to hold on?" Ranger pulled again, harder this time. Understanding flashed across Clint's face. "You still remember?" He wrapped one hand around Ranger's collar. "Okay? Lead the way." Ranger leaned forward. Every muscle in his powerful body tightened. He began pulling, slowly, patiently, foot by foot. Clint pushed with his good leg while Ranger dragged most of his weight across the concrete. Smoke thickened around them. Visibility dropped to only a few feet. Outside, firefighters finally reached the isolation wing. One look at the collapsed hallway told them everything. "We'll need hydraulic cutters." "No time. The fire's spreading." Sam pointed toward the emergency exit on the far side of the building. "They'll head there!" Without waiting for permission, she ran. Inside, Ranger suddenly stopped. His ears twitched. He stared at the emergency exit. It wouldn't open. The earthquake had twisted the steel frame. Clint pushed with both hands. Nothing. Again. Nothing. They were trapped. Smoke burned Clint's lungs. His vision blurred. He leaned against the wall. "I'm sorry, buddy." He looked at Ranger. "I guess this is as far as we go." Ranger stared at him. For 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the German Shepherd turned toward the sealed door. Every firefighter outside would later swear they had never heard anything like it. Ranger barked. Not wildly, not desperately. Each bark came with perfect rhythm, precise, measured, powerful, exactly the way a police canine alerts rescue teams during search operations. Again, again, again. Sam froze, her eyes widened. "I know that bark." She sprinted toward the emergency release panel. "There! They're behind this wall!" Firefighters attacked the damaged door with hydraulic spreaders. Metal screamed. Smoke poured through tiny openings. Again! The machine pushed harder. Steel bent. Another inch. Another. Inside. Clint had nearly lost consciousness. Ranger refused to leave him. Instead, the German Shepherd lay across Clint's chest, shielding him from falling debris, the same way Daniel Reyes had once shielded him from bullets. Outside, the steel finally gave way. Daylight burst into the smoke-filled corridor. "There! I see them!" Firefighters rushed inside. One reached Clint, another reached Ranger, but Ranger wouldn't move. He stood protectively over Clint. One firefighter slowly knelt. "It's okay, boy. We're here to help." Ranger looked down at Clint. Clint managed a weak smile. "It's all right. You did your job." Only then did Ranger step aside. Together, the firefighters carried Clint outside. The moment fresh air hit his face, he took the deepest breath of his life. Ranger never left his side, not once. As paramedics wrapped Clint's injured leg, another shout erupted across the parking lot. "Director Holloway!" Everyone turned. Part of the Eastern Administration wing had collapsed. Holloway had gone back inside searching for employee records before the second aftershock. Now, he was trapped beneath broken concrete. Rescue teams couldn't reach him. The hallway was too unstable. Nobody knew exactly where he was. Before anyone could react, Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His nose caught something in the wind. He looked toward the damaged building. Without hesitation, he ran. "Ranger!" Clint called after him. The German Shepherd never slowed. He disappeared through the dust. Minutes passed. No one spoke. Then, from somewhere deep inside the wreckage, one bark, then another, always the same rhythm. Firefighters followed the sound. 4 minutes later, they found Holloway alive beneath a collapsed support beam, bruised, bleeding, but alive. The first thing Holloway saw after being pulled free was Ranger sitting quietly beside him, waiting. The same dog he had condemned to die. Holloway stared at him for a long time, then looked toward Clint. His voice shook. "I was wrong." No one answered. There was nothing left to say. 3 months later, the Pacific Coast Canine Rescue Center reopened. The isolation wing no longer existed. In its place stood a new rehabilitation center. Above its entrance, a bronze plaque read, "Second Chance Program." Director Holloway stood before reporters. His speech lasted less than 5 minutes. I spent 20 years believing some dogs were beyond hope. He looked toward Ranger lying peacefully beside Clint. I wasn't looking at broken animals. I was looking at broken hearts. The difference changed my life. The euthanasia order was officially destroyed. Ranger went home with Clint that same afternoon. The first weeks weren't easy. Some nights Ranger woke from nightmares, barking toward invisible enemies. Some mornings Clint woke first, finding Ranger resting his head quietly against the side of the bed. Neither tried to fix the other. They simply stayed together, healing. One quiet day, nearly a year later, Clint sat beside the Pacific Ocean, watching Ranger chase birds across the beach. The old leather collar that once belonged to Duke rested safely in Clint's pocket. Around Ranger's neck hung a new collar. Inside the tag, one sentence had been engraved: "What broke us doesn't have to define us." Clint smiled as Ranger ran back across the sand. The German shepherd dropped a piece of driftwood at his feet, tail wagging, eyes full of life. For the first time in years, neither of them was waiting for someone who would never come home. They had found each other. Sometimes, the soul you think you're rescuing ends up rescuing yours instead.